everybody. Good afternoon. I guess it's morning still for a few of you out west. This is Ken Brown with Transportation Energy Partners. I want to welcome you to today's webinar. We have a star-studded panel for you today. Obviously, there's a lot of action going on in Washington in terms of the tax bill and the federal appropriations process and the renewable fuel standard, and we're going to bring you up to date on all of those items. So welcome, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. If you have any questions, just type them in the questions box on your panel on your screen, and we'll take as many questions as we can. So here we go. First of all, before we start, I want to thank all of our many sponsors who help make the work of Transportation Energy Partners possible. As always, we very much appreciate your support. Here are our panelists. You're going to hear from Allison Cunningham from NGB America, Genevieve Cullen from the Electric Drive Transportation Association, Phil Square with the National Propane Gas Association, and Doug Whitehead with the National Biodiesel Board. Welcome, panelists, and thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Very briefly, I know all of you know this, but just remind you who Transportation Energy Partners is. We work with the 90 plus Clean Cities coalitions around the country and all of your 15,000 stakeholders. We work to keep the coalitions and stakeholders informed of key federal policies, programs, and funding opportunities. And we work to educate policymakers here in Washington and the Congress and the federal agencies about the importance of advancing markets for cleaner fuels and vehicles. I think, as everybody knows, we have our annual Energy Independence Summit coming up February 11th through the 14th here in Washington, D.C. We will be meeting with administration and congressional leaders. There will be updates on the funding opportunities through the Volkswagen settlement, participation from industry leaders, roundtables with federal agencies. We will, on Tuesday, we'll be meeting with over 250 congressional offices, and we'll have the annual UPS hosted reception at their townhouse on Capitol Hill on Tuesday evening. So if you have not registered for the summit yet, please do so as soon as you can at transportationenergypartners.org. Just a reminder of the federal priorities for Transportation Energy Partners and our stakeholders. One is to extend and maintain tax incentives for alternative fuels, vehicles, and infrastructure, to maintain and, if possible, increase federal funding for key alternative fuels programs, to preserve the renewable fuel standard, and to authorize the DOE Clean Cities program. So with that, we're going to first talk about, I want to remind you that a number of federal tax incentives expired at the end of 2016, which most of you are aware of. These are the tax incentives that have played such a critical role in advancing markets for alternative fuels and vehicles. And so one of the things we're going to talk about are where these are at and the prospects for extending them. So with that, what I'm going to do is now turn it over to Genevieve Cullen. I think as everybody knows, the tax bill has been moving quickly through the Congress, and Genevieve is going to give us an update on where we stand. Genevieve Cullen with the Electric Drive Transportation Association. Thanks, Genevieve.
Thank you, Ken. Just briefly, for those of y'all who don't know who I am, I'm president of EDTA. We are the Cross Industry Trade Association. Our promoting electrification in transportation. Our members are the entire value chain of the industry, from materials to manufacturing to end users. So we have a pretty diverse group of folks who are all working together to ensure that federal and state policies are helping us advance electrification, and top among them this year is tax policy. Unless you've just arrived from another planet, you're probably aware that Congress is working on tax reform. They announced today that they have a deal in principle, and they said it's not only in principle is in italics. What that means is nothing is solid until it's inked, right? But they will have the first and only open meeting of the conferees on their separate tax reform bills this afternoon, starting at 2. We expect to actually see text by Friday, if it doesn't leak before that. And they want to vote on a bill next week, and certainly before the new senator from Alabama is sworn in. For those of us who care about the energy issues in particular in this bill, I think what's notable is reports on the, well, let's start with where things went into conference, and that was the House bill would have repealed the Section 30D consumer credit for purchases of plug-in electric drive vehicles. The Senate bill was silent on that credit, meaning it would leave the credit in place. Obviously, we were supporting the Senate position, and I know a lot of you weighed in support of the Senate position as well, for which I thank you. The reports that are coming out today suggest that the Senate position has prevailed. In fact, it's probably part of a larger agreement between House and Senate leadership to leave as much as possible energy issues out of this bill and deal with them in a subsequent, potentially extender package, which is later on the agenda of this call. So we think it looks positive for the Senate position, i.e., leaving the plug-in credit in place, as we move towards towards actually seeing text of this bill. But we are not taking anything for granted, and we certainly, do not believe that anything is final until someone signs this. So we're keeping vigilant on it, but we're feeling optimistic at the moment, and probably will know a whole lot more by the end of the day today.
Great, thanks, Genevieve. So that's good news, and hopefully when we see the written text, it will remain good news. The other piece of this is that, as Genevieve mentioned, is that the expired alternative fuel incentives for biodiesel, propane, natural gas, and infrastructure were not included in the tax reform, so they still remain expired and not extended. However, there is an effort to extend those incentives, and I'm going to turn it over to first Allison Cunningham from NGB America, and then Phil Square from the Propane Gas Association to talk a little bit about where the effort is at to extend these incentives through separate legislation. So Allison, take it away.
Thank you, Ken. My name is Allison Cunningham. I'm the Director of Federal Government Affairs for NGB America. We are the National Trade Association working for increased use of natural gas as a transportation fuel. We have over 200 members across the country and into Canada, and we work a lot with groups like Clean Cities and fleets and local municipalities on many of their transportation decisions. So as Genevieve mentioned, the tax reform deal has been struck, and they're hoping to send that to the president to sign next week. That was the first crucial step for extenders. All along, as Ken mentioned, they hadn't been dealing with these energy issues as part of the tax reform bill. That was largely due to bird rule spending limit impact from the Senate, which is a restriction the House doesn't have to deal with. But essentially, they would have to keep within $1.5 trillion limit, and so they didn't want to have a bunch of energy extender credits in there that would be kind of messing with their math. So moving forward on that, AF, the alt fuel tax credit and others were not addressed in tax reform. They still have a lot of big issues that they need to address by year end, such as the investment tax credits for certain renewables. They have some nuclear issues, et cetera. So a lot of people have a vested interest in ensuring that these extenders are addressed and taken care of. As Ken mentioned as well, these expired at the end of 2016, and so be hopeful that they would get this resolved by the end of 2017, but we're not sure at this point whether extenders would then be retroactive for 2017. I think most of that depends on timing. As of today, when senators were leaving their conference meeting on tax reform, Murkowski and Senator Thune both told reporters that they anticipate taking care of extenders in this package, but that the timing was unclear. They see the most likely vehicle for this as the year-end spending bill. I'll go into a little more detail on that in a minute. Senator Grassley had been leading the charge due to some other energy issues that he cares about, and it's crucial for many of you on this call, and I know for us, the alt fuel tax credit is a 50 cent per gallon alternative fuel credit is the big issue that we have been lobbying on, and Senator Grassley included that in one of the amendments he introduced in the Senate markup on tax reform. This is crucial because we had been hearing initially that only extenders that had been introduced via a bill in this year would be dealt with as part of the extenders discussion. And then we also heard that that may include amendments that were offered to the tax reform bill. I have not heard whether that's still the criteria or not, but I think they just wanted to say, hey, you know, we want to have text for all these extenders already ready to go. We don't want this to just be something that gets, you know, bigger and more extensive as it goes on. Issues arise because the House was much less interested in an extenders package. The Senate is who traditionally has stepped up in the past and taken care of these issues. So spending bills being passed before the year end will really squeeze the House into supporting this as their big last vote before they go home for the holidays. NGBA has been working, as I mentioned, on the alt fuels tax credit reinstatement, and we've been engaging Senate finance members to obtain their support. They've been laying low in the last couple of weeks and have been kind of playing shy. I think it's because they're not very happy with the tax reform process of the bill that they're being forced to vote on. So we've been engaging our networks to reach out to Senator Bennett in Colorado and Ranking Member Wyden. So if anybody or any of your organizations are located in Colorado or Oregon and would be interested in helping us to engage them, please reach out to me. We also have been working with Phil and others on an all parties letter to send to the Hill for the alt fuels tax credit extension. It's fuel neutral, and if anybody would like to be listed on that, feel free to just shoot me an email and let me know the name of your organization as you would like for it to be listed. And that's one of the biggest things that we're doing right now. We have a ton of signatories already. We'd love to have even more organizations listed there. So now hopefully, after they passed the 2-week CR last week, they'll have until the 22nd to get something done. I won't go too in the weeds on spending because I know someone else will speak to that. But I think that it's also worth noting that we've been under the assumption and under the hope that comprehensive tax reform is going to be finished by the end of this year, that they're not going to have any bumps along the way. You know, now we have to account for a new senator coming in, who's now a Democrat, which makes the math a little bit more difficult. But also, you've seen, I'm sure, in the news about sexual harassment. There's a big report that is expected to come out this week from the Washington Post. So I will not count that out as one of the factors we need to pay attention to if there are a lot of people named there. And I'm hearing rumors that even, you know, Speaker Ryan would rather those lists not come out at the same time. I think they're concerned that this could upend any progress that they've been making or affect their whip counts. So with that, I will go ahead and I'm glad to take any questions or turn back over to you on how a spending bill might come together. Ken, unless you want me to speak to that a little more.
No, that's great. Thanks, Allison. Phil Square from the Propane Gas Association. Do you have any anything you want to add on the extenders effort?
No, I think Allison really summed it up really well. You know, this is one of those instances where, you know, all the sectors that benefit from this provision, the alternative fuel tax credit, are really coming together. And when you look at the signatories that we've received so far, just in the last 36 hours, they're really broad and really all over the map, and they show just how diverse the people are and the organizations are that rely on alternative fuels and transportation. And I really think that this is going to be something people kind of forget sometimes, just how ubiquitous these fuels are and how much the gains that these fuels have made in the past, not only because of, but a lot because of these tax credits have really given us a way to approach customers in a different way. And so there's no one fuel that's going to be the best for everyone. And that's what makes this provision so effective. And so if you have interest in looking at this letter, really all it is, it's very simple and straightforward that says, we, the undersigned, support the alternative fuel tax credit, with a little bit more explanation, but that's essentially it for environmental and economic growth purposes. So, Ken, I'd sort of leave it at that this is something we're really, really keen on. And if we can show the folks on the Hill support Senator Grassley and what he's trying to do for us and others, I think that'll be really effective. So with that, I'll just sort of turn it back over to you, Ken.
Great, thanks, Phil. And Doug, is there anything from the biodiesel perspective that you'd like to add in about the tax extenders?
Thank you, Ken. No, that's been covered very well. We are hopeful that tax reform will get through, and we could focus on this and get included in the CR next week. We've heard that, and we've heard, again, like was mentioned in the January omnibus bill. So just like everybody encourages, find your champions and keep the pressure on them.
Great. Thanks, everybody. There's one, Genevieve, if you're still with us, we got one question, which is, who are the best champions of electric vehicles and plug-ins in the Congress? It's kind of a broad question, but if there are folks who've been leading the charge that you want to give a shout out to, somebody asked about that.
Well, it's a pretty long list and probably longer than I can go into here. And I'm glad to whoever asked, you can direct them to me specifically, and we can talk about it. But I think for purposes of where we're standing today, I think on the Republican finance side, I think Mr. Heller, Mr. Portman, Mr. Scott have been supportive of the credit, and I think they did a lot of good work on the Senate bill. All of the Democrats on Senate Finance are hugely supportive. Wyden, Cantwell, Stabenow, others. I don't mean to by omission diminish anybody else's contribution. Just talking off the top of my head. On the House side, obviously, on Ways and Means, while the outcome in their bill was not as we had hoped, that we did, we had great support from Representative Bishop and Reichert, and again, the Ways and Means Democrats have been uniformly supportive. There are larger and a diverse set of bipartisan supporters throughout the House and Senate, and again, glad to talk with whoever wants to, get to work in contacting them if they want to just contact me directly afterwards.
Great. And to take one step back on the tax extenders, again, if you are interested in, we need as many folks to sign on to the letter to Congress supporting the tax extenders, and you can email Allison. Her email is right here on the screen, acunningham@ngbamerica.org, and also Transportation Energy Partners will send a follow-up email encouraging people to sign on as well, and we'll include Allison's contact information. Does that work, Allison?
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Great. All right, we are now going to move on to funding. I think, as people know, we've had two primary funding programs that we've concentrated our efforts on. One is to maintain funding for the Clean Cities program, and second is to maintain funding for the EPA Clean Diesel grants. I think, as most people know, the federal government, the Congress has not completed the appropriations process for fiscal year 2018. As people know, the fiscal year started on October 1, and so Congress is operating under what's called a continuing resolution, which essentially funds the government at last year's level until they reach an agreement for spending levels for this year. I will add that it's not that unusual for us to be at this stage of the year and the process not to be completed. In fact, it's typically in recent years, the appropriations process has not been completed until generally sometime between Thanksgiving and the end of the year. So we may not make it by the end of the year to have the full deal done, but hopefully it will be done by the end of January. So technically where we're at is Congress and the President agreed on a short-term resolution which expires on the 22nd, and then they will have to extend the resolution again because they will not be finished with the appropriations process. It's possible that they may include the tax extenders on this next continuing resolution. So that's one effort that folks are pushing for, but the general consensus is that the effort will be to complete the FY 2018 appropriations process by the end of January. Obviously, there are big global issues that need to be negotiated that are that the House and Senate and the administration need to agree on to move forward. They include everything from what are the overall spending levels going to be, what's going to be the balance between domestic spending and military spending, what are they going to do with the children's health insurance program, what are they going to do with the efforts to extend or to protect the dreamers, and other, what are they going to do with emergency funding for victims of the storms in Puerto Rico, Florida, and Texas. All those things need to be negotiated out before they can finalize the nitty-gritty of, you know, how much is going to go to the Department of Energy and how much is going to go to Clean Cities and the EPA Clean Diesel grants programs. In the meantime, the full House has passed all of their appropriations bills, and the Senate Appropriations Committee has approved all of their bills. So those will be the basis of the final negotiations for the specific programs when they get to that. Here's a picture table showing where we're at in terms of the DOE Clean Cities program. Shows the fiscal year 2017 level. 34 million was the funding level for Clean Cities. There was 15 million allocated to competitive grants, and there was language recommending that the grants be focused on $500,000 to $1 million and include at least one Clean Cities coalition as a partner. The next line shows what Transportation Energy Partners proposed language was this year. We're proposing an increase to 40 million, 20 million for grants and the same language as the House included in FY17. I think, as most people know, the president's budget proposed elimination of the program. The House committee report this year indicated strong support for the program, but it did not recommend a specific funding level. And that was partly because the final allocations for funding had not been agreed on, and they weren't sure how much they were going to have, and they were trying to basically indicate support without providing a specific level. And they did include the language from last year that the grant should be in the $500,000 to $1 million range, with One Clean Cities Coalition as a partner. The Senate this year did some interesting things that we're trying to, with good intentions, but we're trying to fix them. They allocated $28 million to the program, which is not as good as last year, but a reasonable number. And I think we have reason to believe that hopefully that may increase a little in the final bill. But they allocated $24 million to competitive grants. And while we've been advocating for significant funding to go to deployment grants, we're concerned that this level of grants would undermine the overall program because it would eliminate funding for all of the technical support and potentially the direct support that goes to the Clean Cities Coalition. So we're working with both the House and Senate appropriators to fix this and have a smaller portion go to grants, so enough money can go to the labs and to the other folks who provide technical support and things like the station locator and the A-Fleet tool and all kinds of things that DOE does to support the coalitions and the stakeholders in the program. The second thing that the Senate does is, in terms of the competitive grants, it encourages the department to favor states with higher greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. And again, while that's well-intentioned, we're concerned, we're generally opposed to favoring any states over any others. We think all groups and all states and all coalitions should have equal opportunity to apply for the competitive grants. And this would hurt those states that have a higher percentage of their greenhouse gas emissions coming from stationary sources as opposed to transportation. So again, we're working with the appropriators to fix this. It's unclear where we're going to end up on the funding levels, but we're working hard on this, and we're hopeful that we'll at least be in the $25 to $28 million level for next year, and then hopefully we'll at least be at last year's level. So that's the story on Clean Cities funding. In terms of the clean diesel grants, the last year's level was $60 million for the program. The president's budget included $10 million. The House included $75 million, and the Senate included $40 million. So I think it's reasonable to think, and hopefully we'll end up at least at last year's level of $60 million, though again, this remains to be, it's not done until it's done. But that's where we stand on appropriations. Thanks to all of you who participated in our campaign to really, we had over 700 organizations sign on to our letters to the House and Senate appropriators supporting the Clean Cities program. And a similar letter went in on the diesel emission grants, and I think that made a big difference in continuing support for the program. So hopefully this will be done by the end of January. The there's an outside chance that they won't be able to reach agreement on this stuff. And if that's the case, funding will continue at last year's level. If they end up doing a year-long continuing resolution, the program will be funded at the $34 million level for last year, and so that will be not so bad either. So I think we're in decent shape, but the final details need to be worked out. With that, hang on one second. We're going to talk a little bit. There's been some news and progress on the renewable fuel standard, so I'm going to turn it over to Doug Whitehead from the National Biodiesel Board. And again, if anybody's got questions on any of this stuff, please type in your questions into the panel on your screen. So Doug Whitehead from National Biodiesel Board is going to give us an update on the renewable fuel standard. Thanks, Doug.
All right. Thank you, Ken. As Ken said, I'm Doug Whitehead, Chief Operating Officer for the National Biodiesel Board. I've been working out of the Washington, D.C. office since this past July, and have enjoyed working on all our priorities. The first priority was working on EPA's annual RVO rulemaking. So in July, we proposed that, we reacted to their proposed rule, which kept the biomass-based diesel volume flat at 2.1 billion gallons and actually cut the advanced from 4.28 to 4.24. We testified at the hearing in July and asked for an incremental increase as the statute calls for. And during the proposed rulemaking timeframe, something happened for the first time that's ever happened. They released another rulemaking notice, the NOTA, Notice of Data Availability. And within that NOTA, it reduced biomass-based diesel and the advanced categories. And it looked to even reduce in this year's rule. So that seemed to be a test from the new EPA administrator to the biodiesel industry, and was very proud of our industry and our industry's partners and champions that all took offense to this ill-written NOTA, and looks like we beat that back in the final rule. However, the industry really wasn't wanting to be judged against the NOTA. We were wanting to be judged against the proposed rule. So we had a little mixed bag of reaction when on November 30 the final rule came out and held the biomass-based diesel volumes flat for the first time. A subtle increase, which is really not an increase on the advanced from 4.28 to 4.29. So we have been working together with our champions and our industry to decide what our next steps may be. Certainly there's the litigation approach, which we're trying to understand what that gains us, or if it's a necessary evil in today's business world just to get that paperwork done. We anticipate challenges from our opposition, so we may get in the middle of this as an intervener or friend of the court. But certainly since the proposed rule was out, there's been lots of activity at the White House. There's been lots of activity from the merchant refiners, all focusing on what we are going to do to solve a RIN problem. So we are asking our champions for help. Actually, staff is meeting in the White House today on the renewable fuel standard. We understand there'll be another meeting with the president potentially tomorrow. There was one last week, the famous meeting that Senator Cruz requested. We also know that we have to continue telling our story to USDA and DOE so that we're not just relying on the EPA's knowledge and of the program and knowing the differences between ethanol and biodiesel. So we will continue to work with other organizations in the industry to look for ways to create a more transparent RIN market. I think we all know that this issue really is about market share, but we are constantly and have been constantly working on some ideas on how to relieve some pressure to these refiners since the final rule came out. And you'll see on this chart again that the biomass-based diesel has remained flat at 2.1 billion, and there's the advanced number. Some of the discussion within the final rule did revolve around our trade case. Just to briefly mention that we had filed countervailing duty and anti-dumping cases against Indonesia and Argentina, and so far we've been successful there. And the EPA did note, kind of in a circular fashion, the trade issue. That could avail around 400 million gallons to us, which would be a net positive to domestic biodiesel producers. But we think that decision is not germane to the RFS and the intent of the law. That is the RFS to incrementally grow these volumes. And our industry stands ready to produce the fuel and actually blow through the number that the EPA sets. So there's more positive than negative within this rule, but as a matter of law, we think they missed the mark and missed an opportunity. And had they just had the wisdom to give us a small bump, some incremental growth, we would have been holding hands with the EPA and the White House and looking how to make the whole program better going forward. And with that, Ken, I'll entertain any questions, or if I've left something out, please let me know.
Doug, can you say a little bit about, and I don't fully understand this, but I know was quite a debate and an effort around where they were gonna, who was gonna get the RINs. They were looking at moving that. Can you say a little bit about that and where that ended up?
Well, I can say that there's been lots of things tried, from point of obligation to RINs for export, etc. All of that has been beat back. Nothing on that front has changed. Where the focus now is the price of the RIN. And we have some ideas on how to reduce that. One would be give us our tax credit back. There'll be more fuel blended in the market, and that will relieve RIN price pressure. There's some other things that we could talk about on the RVP side with ethanol or RIN transparency, etc. But again, this is a market share issue that they're mad about. This law has been in place successfully for 10 years. They knew what it was going to do then. They've known what it's going to do the whole time. So the talk about those other RINs for export or point of obligation, it's just more of a distraction to try to tear down the program.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming that the folks who are looking to undermine the program, the petroleum industry, they're up in force on Capitol Hill as well. So it's important when folks are in DC for the Energy Independence Summit to be up there and, re-educating people about these issues.
Yes, it's always important to re-educate. And certainly,
Great.
I've come to know a lot more about the RFS in the last 6 months, and we know that we have some detractors on the big oil side, but we also have some quiet supporters that do find profitability in renewable fuels, biodiesel, and ethanol. So the real detractors right now are a handful of merchant refiners, and then they have Valero, of course. But I think we're making progress, and we just need to tell our story because it's a good story. It's a good American story. It's a good story about job creation in rural America. So yes, please keep re-educating all our champions.
Great. Thank you, Doug. So checking to see if anybody else has any questions. We got one question. Will the presentation be posted? Yes, the presentation will be posted. In addition, we're recording the presentation, and we'll send out an email that lets people know how they can connect with that. Last call for any questions. Are TEP and partners supporting more federal funding than the total amount we're asking? I'm not sure I understand this question. So I'm not sure I can answer it. Maybe somebody are asking for more funding to clean up dirty diesel than the total amount we're asking for all alternative clean fuel funding. I'm not sure I understand. I mean, there are other federal funding programs that are important in addition to the Clean Cities program and the Diesel Emission Reduction Act grants, which we support, especially through the transportation bill. One is the CMAQ funds, which is probably the largest source of federal funding used for alternative fuels and vehicles. We're also supportive of the Federal Transit Administration, which provides significant funds to for folks to purchase alternative fuel buses. That's an important program. And then there are also Department of Agriculture funds that are also important for alternative fuels and vehicles. Checking to see if there are any other questions. I will give our panelists one last chance if anybody has a final comment they want to make. Allison, Phil, Doug.
I'll just say
Go ahead,
I have
Allison.
emails about the alt fuels tax credit letter. I'll wait until I get everybody who's interested has reached out to me, and I'll send a follow-up email to everyone that has the letter text and just letting you know what to do. But primarily, we just need folks' organization names. So thank you.
Great. Anything else from Phil or Doug before we sign off?
Not from Phil.
Not from Doug. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all the panelists. Just as a wrap up, obviously it's very important. This administration still is, they're still just finishing up their first year. We have a lot of education to do with the new folks, so that's very important. Keep letting people know what you're doing out at the community level, and continue to work with your members of Congress, educate them about what you're doing in the local communities, invite them to your ribbon cuttings and projects and workshops, meet with them back in the district, send them your newsletters and press releases, continue to rally your stakeholders, and be sure to come to the Energy Independence Summit in Washington in February. This is going to be a very critical year. Obviously, lots is going on. Some of this may be resolved before then, and some of it may not. But either way, we need as many people to come to Washington. And for the Clean Cities coalitions out there, please invite your stakeholders. Last year we had more local and regional stakeholders than ever, and we hope to top that again this year. So thanks again to the panelists. Thanks to everybody for participating, and we look forward to seeing you in DC in February. Take care, everybody.